Next, from the City Club of Chicago, Republican Congressman Peter Roskam talks about the continued rise in the national debt and the partisan fighting over an effort to pass a federal budget. This runs about 30 minutes.
It was a privilege to get to know Peter Roskam back when he was just a regular person and before he was a national rock star. Something I enjoyed more years ago than I really want to admit at this moment in front of all of you. And I want to say that as someone who has been privileged myself to work at the U.S. House of Representatives, it's particularly gratifying to see a representative of our generation walking in the footsteps of leadership in the United States House of Representatives. So the footsteps of Les Aarons, if you go back, the footsteps of Bob Michel, those are the footpaths around the Capitol on which today, if you're in D.C., you would see Peter Roskam. If you're familiar with the United States House of Representatives, the People's House, a very special place indeed, you know that there are several committees that are very important. There's the Rules Committee controls the floor, Appropriations Committee controls spending, the Ways and Means Committee is the grand dame of the committees in the United States House of Representatives. And I think it's a particular distinction of Peter's that as he has taken on the responsibilities of leadership and he has risen in the esteem of his colleagues on both sides of the aisle, but also in the measure of the senior leaders in the House to the fourth ranking position of the majority party, he maintains a very active docket of issues at the Ways and Means Committee, especially with respect to trade. So I hope that we will hear a little bit this afternoon about the importance of economic development growth and one of Peter's many specialties, which is the importance of trade. So I want to take this note to say thank you for Peter for your service, and I want to ask all of you to remember that when he's finished, the conversation turns back to you. You have the little cards, write down your questions, let's have an active give and take. It's a distinctive element of a City Club appearance. With that, ladies and gentlemen, a strong downtown Chicago Republican City Club welcome for the United States of Representatives Republican Whip, Peter Roskam.
Thank you very much. I am really pleased, and I'd like to introduce my dad, Swede Roskam, who's at the table. Let me brag on my old man, 83 years old, and he just recently throttled back to working half-time for the Oil Dry Corporation of America at 83. That's impressive. A little intimidating as a son. Also, I was really pleased to see that I was seated next to Warren Wolfson, retired judge, but in my life, Warren Wolfson was my Sherpa guide when I was a law student 25 years ago, and he was my trial advocacy coach. Judge, will you take a bow? One of my absolutely favorite things to do is to be home in a constituency out in Kane County, out in Lawson's district or someplace, sitting at a non-political event at a table just like yours. And to be interacting with somebody at a hospital venue or a nonprofit fundraising type of thing. And I'm seated next to a type A personality type, you know, a doer, a maker, a goer, kind of a CEO type. And during the course of the conversation, we introduce ourselves to one another, and hey, what do you do? Well, I'm Dave, and I run ABC Widget Company, and I learned a little bit about ABC Widgets. He says, what do you do? I say, well, I serve in the House of Representatives. Oh. I mean, you can just sense this. First of all, he's thinking, I didn't like any of you guys in high school to begin with. Secondly, I don't know, and right away it's sort of jumping into, how come nothing gets done out there? How come nothing gets done? And I absolutely love these questions. I love the conversation. I lure him further out and out and out into how he, John Boehner ought to tell these guys to do this, or the president ought to do that. And by the time I'm done with this guy, he's thanking me for serving. Basically, thank you so much for what you're doing, man. Because here's the kind of system that we have in place. So putting aside all the drama and all the consternation, there are structures in place that our founders laid down that are obstacles to get things done. Now, what are those? Why do I talk about these? Well, they're important. They're important to recognize it within the context of trying to move forward. And here's a couple things to think about. Our founders had a fairly low view of human nature, didn't they? And they had an expectation that power was going to be very, very diffuse. And there were going to be many exit ramps along the way to try and get something done. And those exit ramps are now in full bloom, basically. And you see that the ability to move forward is a disadvantage. You are advantaged in public policy in this country when you don't want to see anything change. That's your advantage. When you want to see affirmative change, trying to move forward, there's a disadvantage. Now, why is that important? It's important in the context of looking at what's going on in the state of Illinois, and particularly what's going on in the federal government. So, here we have recent news that the state's unemployment rate has jumped 9.5%. Now, we are losing the battle as it relates to regional states. Why? Because other states have not engaged in the avoidance behavior that we've seen come out of Springfield. Other states have rubbed dirt on their problems. They've figured out how to deal with this pension leviathan, and they've ultimately come up with remedies that have now moved forward, and as a result, they're growing at faster rates, they are more buoyant, they are more vibrant, they are more dynamic from an economic point of view. But what has Springfield done? Springfield was faced with really an epic budget problem. Now we've hit the $100 billion figure, $100 billion in unpaid liabilities or unfunded liabilities. And what was Springfield's first response? The first response was to raise taxes. Taxes go up, revenues underperform, as they always do, and now where does that leave the state of Illinois? It leaves the state with almost $10 billion in unpaid bills, the second amount of per capita debt as any state in the union, higher than average unemployment rate, open criticism from the bond markets that can't find enough negative adjectives to describe our state. Now action from the Securities Exchange Commission as it relates to allegations of fraud surrounding pension disclosures, and that's an example of what not to do. Now, I serve with members from all across the country who look at the state of Illinois, unfortunately, as a punchline right now. Now, you know and I know that our state is a great place. Our state has an unbelievably strong manufacturing base. It's got a financial services base. It's got huge agriculture. It's strategically located in an incredibly important part of the country. It has all of the elements to be a robust and dynamic economy, not just leading the Midwest, but leading the country. And what's happening? Based on bad decisions in Springfield, I would argue, the state of Illinois is underperforming, and it's underperforming based on what? Avoidance behavior. Basically, stiff-arming, common-sense solutions that say, here's how you move this thing forward, here's how Wisconsin did it, here's how Indiana did it, here's how Michigan did it, here's how Ohio did it. These are not pathways that are new to anybody. These are well-trodden, predictable pathways, and the way to move forward is to rub some dirt on it and figure it out down in Springfield. Now, why is this important as a national issue? It's important as a national issue because it exactly mirrors what's going on in Washington, D.C. You've got an underlying structural problem. That is an entitlement system that will be bankrupt within, pick your number, 10, 15, 20 years as it relates to Medicare. You've got healthcare inflation and a demographic wave that is outpacing the rest of the economy significantly. 10,000 people every 24 hours are newly eligible for Medicare. 10,000 people every 24 hours are newly eligible for Social Security. And if we don't follow through and try and figure that out, then ultimately you get on the wrong side of these curves, and the debt situation that the United States is about 6 times as great per person as the debt situation that the state of Illinois is in. Right now, state policy in Springfield has an $8,000 burden on every man, woman, and child in the state of Illinois. By contrast, the $16+ trillion that is the debt burden of the United States of America today, every man, woman, and child has a $53,000 debt burden. Now, how do we move forward? I'll tell you the way not to move forward. The way not to move forward is to avoid the whole situation. Let me take you on a company tour that I took up in McHenry County within the past 4 months. I'm doing a tour up there of a manufacturer. And I go in and I'm visiting with the leadership. I visit with see the guys on the floor. I do a Q&A afterwards with employees. But as I'm walking out the door of this McHenry County manufacturer, the owner, the guy who, 40-year-old guy who's bought the company, something like that, pulls me aside and he said, hey, I got to give you some news. What's up? I'm leaving. What do you mean you're leaving? He said, I'm taking this company, lock, stock, and barrel, and I'm moving it to Tennessee. I said, are they giving you, what do they do? Do they hustle you? What? No. They're not giving me anything. He said, I'm taking this company out of Illinois and I'm moving it to Tennessee. Why? I'm going to have rational tax rates. I'm going to have rational work rules. I'm going to have rational workers' compensation rates. And I want to go to a company, or I want to go to a place where my success is celebrated, not criticized. I think Mayor Daley had a line that I will attribute to him, and that was, companies, when they leave, they don't issue press releases. They just leave. And so now if you take that mentality of the ability of that company to say he's leaving based on an adverse economic impact around him, and he's not being lured by any sort of tantalizing inducement, just a common sense positive business environment, think about what we're dealing with from a global perspective. 95% of the world's consumers are outside of the United States. And we have worldwide American companies that are competing with a tax code that puts them at an incredible disadvantage. What we can do as part of reclaiming a competitiveness attitude and a competitiveness agenda in Washington for the entire country is to reform the tax code, but to reform the tax code to make the U.S. tax code the most competitive tax jurisdiction in the world. We have about 1.5 million Americans who are under arms defending us today. We have approximately 1.2 million Americans who are deployed and employed to help us comply with our own tax code. Or said another way, it's not an overstatement then to say it takes an army for us to comply with our own rules that we impose on ourselves. And so as we're looking forward, what we're trying to do from the House Republican point of view is to say, look, avoidance behavior creates failure. And it creates failure on such a massive scale that when it all comes crashing down, you don't really care even who's to blame. It's so bad, and you've left so much opportunity on the table that it is foolish at an epic level. So rather than doing that, let's take a running start at these problems. And the running start was to pass a budget, not 1 year, not 2 years, but now 3 years in a row, the House has passed a budget. And the House budget of this year will balance in 10 years. Now, there's a subtlety to language. When Warren Wolfson was teaching me as a trial advocacy student, there were certain words that we would use, there were certain descriptions that we would use in order to persuade a jury. And so the use and the power of language and the definition of terms is very important. And what we see happening in Washington, D.C. right now, and particularly coming from the White House, is a redefinition of some terms that have had a common understanding in our economic lexicon that now we find are being redefined. So, for example, we have historically talked about balancing a budget. And for all the common sense reasons that commonly we would understand a balanced budget is a good thing, in the new lexicon from the White House, they're not claiming balance. And instead, the Senate Democrats, while it's a good thing that they've passed a budget for the first time in 4 years, the budget that they are proposing never balances. Never, ever, ever balances. Ever. By contrast, the House budget balances in 10 years. Now think about that in the context of Illinois. What would it have been like had we had policymakers that got ahead of these curves and dealt with the underlying cost drivers as opposed to going through the gimmicks, raising taxes, and having those underperform? Now, the president, I'm characterizing the president's use of the word balance. He says now, no longer is balance a goal, but the new goal is long-term fiscal long-term fiscal sustainability. That's avoidance behavior. I don't have to deal with this now. That's the exact same rhetoric that we hear coming out of Springfield that puts it off, puts it off, puts it off, and puts it off. There's another term that it's important for us not to redefine, and the term is tax reform. Tax reform historically has looked out over the tax code at loopholes, these little industries or little practices that are living within semicolons of the tax code, and it has said those loopholes will be closed, and we will use that revenues that come out for what? We will use those revenues to push down the rate generally and create a much more competitive tax jurisdiction. That's what you close loopholes for, not now coming from the White House. The White House is now redefining tax reform, and it's using the closure of loopholes, which most folks agree need to go away, but the closure of loopholes instead just to feed more revenues. Now, there's been drama after drama after drama from a fiscal point of view that has come out of Washington. And the argument, I think, is this. Look, the president described an architecture of a 3-to-1 ratio. That was $3 in cuts for every new dollar in revenue. Under the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, $1 trillion in new taxes coming to the federal government. At the end of this past year, 2012, $600 billion in new taxes that are coming into the federal coffers, which is eerily similar to the pathway that the state of Illinois has taken. Now, if we simply go back and go to the taxpayers every 9, 12, 16 weeks and say the remedy is for you to put in more into the system when the underlying drivers haven't been dealt with, what does that look like? That looks like Springfield, and that looks like an epic mess. So what I'm saying today is we've got a good example. Now the challenge for us and the misfortune for us, at least for right now, is that the good example of what not to do is the jurisdiction that we call home. But there's an opportunity for us, I think, to guide Springfield lawmakers to make better decisions, to put off the avoidance behavior, to look to those jurisdictions around us that have done this well, and for us to challenge the White House, and that is to say, look, let's deal with the underlying spending drivers. If we do that, we can start to see the type of recovery that was actually promised in the stimulus package and never came to fruition. Look, I just want to let you know how much I appreciate the opportunity to be in conversation today, how much I value this group and the generous introduction by Chris. It is nice to know that there is a civic-minded group of people that's willing to come out midday and hear different ideas and interact with different presenters. And the more time that I spend in public life, the more convinced I am that there's, I have a much higher view of people who choose to engage substantively, not just who put their names on ballots, but who engage in these issues and are not willing to just recede back and let somebody else fill the void. So if there's people of goodwill like the City Club that are engaging these issues, I'm very hopeful about what tomorrow will bring. And so with that, as we say, I yield back the balance of my time, and let's open it up for questions.
Thank you, Peter. Great. All right, okay, very good. A lot of questions coming in. From JB Jane Johnson. This is a long question, and the moderator reserves the right to edit. The economy is in serious trouble across the board. Do you believe that tax increment financing and the districts that it brings about help financially strapped cities? If not, what other remedy would you offer to help a city that needs that kind of help?
When I was in Springfield, there was a lot of discussion on the Senate Revenue Committee and elsewhere about TIF financing. And I think that there's some examples that you can look to and you say, look, this has been an incredibly powerful thing, and it has been, it has worked and created prosperity where it didn't exist before. And there's other examples that you say, wow, what a disaster, what a squandering of resources. So the great thing about most TIF financing is it's decided at a local level, and I think that's where most of the decisions around it should remain.
Congressman Carl Signeri, father of Brittany at MJ Electric, with all of the issues facing the U.S., what issue has the best chance for Democrats and Republicans to work together as a team?
I think an export agenda is the best place to come together. President Obama articulated a goal that I agree with completely. Within 5 years, he wanted to double exports. And if you look at the agreements that were put together in the last Congress that the president was active with, the free trade agreements with South Korea and with Panama and Colombia, and the change in our relationship from a trade point of view, permanent normal trade relations with Russia, those four things are good. They're good for Chicagoland, they're good for Illinois manufacturers, and I mentioned this a minute ago, but with 95% of the world's consumers outside of the U.S., that's where the action is. So there's a lot of common ground on trade, and I would use that as a foundation upon which to build.
Thank you. Do you support, this is from Graham Grady, Shefsky and Freilich, do you support internet sales tax collection reform? And number two, will the reported appointment of Caroline Kennedy as our next ambassador to Japan help U.S. relations in the Pacific Rim?
This larger question about the online sales tax issue is going to be an issue that, if it's dealt with, will be dealt with in a larger tax reform package. So said another way, if you put a bill on the House floor right now that even rhymes with internet sales tax, it's going to go down. So you've got to have something that is more holistic, and it's got to be part of a larger approach. I don't have, I don't know Ms. Kennedy on a personal basis. I only know her by reputation, and so I just don't have enough insight to know how she'll do as she interacts with Japan.
John Gates, chairman of the RTA. Will and how will the House address the nation's crumbling infrastructure?
The House took up an effort that came out of the Transportation Committee that is I think the seeds of where we need to be going. So the issue is, how do you link up revenues to support a deteriorating infrastructure system. And the key is, we're not going to pass a gas tax. That it's not going to happen, and it'll just leave it there. So where do you go? John Boehner, as Speaker of the House, began to advocate about 36 months ago this idea of linking up energy revenues with infrastructure spending. So to be able to pursue the leasing offshore, for example, and opening up some of those areas, to do the smart exploration and the smart deployment of those resources, and to use those revenues and to link that with infrastructure spending, I think that's the way to go.
Thank you. Kent Griffiths asks, Wolf Point Strategies, will you please give us your definition of crony capitalism, and how do you know it when you see it?
I think I'm looking at it. No, look, crony capitalism would be those types of things that that just you know it when you see it. You know what's a manipulation. You know what's a hustle within the tax code, and you know other provisions that are generally accepted and for the general welfare. And so that's part of the debate that the Ways and Means Committee is having. There's 11 different working groups that that are underway. I'm participating actively as a co-chairman of the manufacturers working group, and I will stipulate that the bumper sticker characterization of crony capitalism is easier to put on a bumper sticker than it is to define. But I'll tell you this, the level of dissatisfaction with the tax code today makes it so that we have an opportunity to reframe this debate. And there's any number of folks that I've talked to who are small business owners that would be willing to give up, pick it, X, Y, Z, different treatment within the tax code, if in exchange they got a simpler code and a lower rate. They'd make that deal in a minute.
Peter Hastings asks, are you familiar with the Common Core proposal to track the metrics of every American child of every age to assess entitlements? Are you in favor of that?
I'm not familiar with it off the top of my head, and tracking anybody for anything by the federal government makes me very, very nervous.
Mark Weiermiller asks about the Illinois pension mess. Would you support IRAs and 401ks on new public sector employees and teachers, or as opposed to a federal bailout?
A federal bailout is not going to happen. There is no appetite in the federal government to come in and pull anybody's cheese out of the fire. It's not going to happen, and our state has to deal with it. Those types of approaches that mirror the private sector in light of where we are today, I think make all the sense in the world.
Sharon Alter asks, two-part question. Number one, what is your personal position on gun control? And number two, what will the U.S. House do about gun control in 2013?
The U.S. House is going to look to the U.S. Senate to see what the U.S. Senate can do on all of these issues. Remember, Senator Reid has a difficult thing to navigate through. He's got 6 or 7 Democrats that are up in 2014 that are up for re-election in states that Mitt Romney beat Barack Obama in the race for president, which means the calculus for them is a very different calculus than the White House is experiencing. So I have a high view of the Second Amendment and continue to have a high view of the Second Amendment. That being said, I think that there's room for common sense things, but there's not going to, what you're not going to see, in my view, is you're not going to see the House get all worked up like it has in the 112th Congress on various issues and only have it land with a thud in the United States Senate. So let's see what the Senate can produce. If the Senate can produce a bill, then the House will certainly entertain it.
Paul LaLiberte of Wunderlich Securities, a member of the City Club, as indeed many of our questioners today have been members. With the current fiscal crisis, Congressman Roskam, in Springfield and in Washington, should high-speed rail be continued? I
would, in terms of priorities, I I would ask John Gates if you had money for high-speed rail or money to continue having folks moving through Barrington or Glen Ellen or Elmhurst or any of these other jurisdictions, I would not deploy it on high-speed rail, and I would definitely deploy it on the infrastructure questions that we have, because our needs are so significant.
Now, this is an actual question from City Club member and indeed Chairman Paul Green. He signed it. I didn't make this one up. Congressman Roskam, when are you going to announce for governor?
I'm way too smart for that, brother. Where are you?
Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it for Peter Roskam.
Thank you very much.
Wait.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.